Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations with History. This will be episode 12, and today we're going to cover the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. I'm once again joined by my astute colleague, Mr. Corey Blevins.
Hello again.
So we're just going to kind of jump right into this with a little bit of context. The Roaring Twenties, which we talked about in our last module, it had its problems. We saw the growth of mass culture. We saw the growth of entertainment and mass production. And one of the things that we talked about was this huge explosion in the stock market, in the prosperity of the American people. More people are able to buy things. This leads to more and more production, and everything looks like it's going great.
It does. And it's so much part of the attitude of the 1920s of like prosperity, getting rich, and having the new car, having the new things, partying. It's a very much like living like a millionaire lifestyle that many Americans have during the 1920s.
Right, and people love it.
Love
it. On the surface, it looks great, but there is a really rickety foundation. It's kind of like when you're in somebody's car and you're driving down the road and you're like, man, it really feels like something's wrong with this car. And they're like, yeah, well, that's because my rear suspension's held together with zip ties.
So then they say, oh, it's fine.
Right.
Just keep going.
But as long as it doesn't break, it's okay. Right. Well, that was basically the attitude that they took during the 1920s. And it comes back to haunt them. So the first thing that is just overlooked during the 1920s, or not really focused upon until too late, is the plight of farmers. That the value of farmland collapses after World War I, shortly after World War I. So this puts farmers in a debt situation where they're defaulting all the way through the 1920s. Farmland is going into default. It's being bought by larger landowners. It's being bought by banks. And farm tenancy, more than doubles. Basically, people are farming land that they don't own anymore because they've lost it due to foreclosures.
Right.
And this really affects mainly the Midwest and the South, and especially the African-American community in the South. And if you look at a map of like really high levels of farm tenancy, it follows the Mississippi River Valley and places that had really high concentrations of African-American population, like Memphis, and then down to like Greenville, Mississippi, and then the Mississippi Delta.
One thing to mention is that when we say sharecropping, we often think about kind of a Reconstruction era way for newly freed slaves to grow crops on land owned by someone else. But sharecropping is still a practice done in the places you just described at this time, right? That did not go away with the end of Reconstruction. That's still happening. And sharecropping was a system that almost never led to prosperity.
Right. And as we just said, it actually got a little bit better because of the World War I boom.
Right.
And then it gets much worse in the 1920s. And there was this boom in farm prices because this extra production was needed. Grain was needed to feed these armies. That all the produce coming out of the United States, farmers, for the first time in a while, were experiencing a real kind of renaissance of land being brought under the plow. That land that had laid dormant for years after the Civil War was brought back under the plow, and they were shipping a lot of their product overseas to these markets where people couldn't produce food because of World War I.
Right.
Well, like, for instance, grain prices doubled during World War I.
Wow.
And what happened was, if you're doing really well, you think, I'll keep doing really well. So what do? You go take out a loan. And a lot of them took out loans to mechanize, to buy a tractor. If you ever bought a tractor, that's not a cheap thing to do.
No.
So while they were incredibly prosperous, they were also racking up a lot of debt, and they were using their farms as collateral. So they would buy 2 or 3 tractors to increase their production, but at the same time, they were using their farm as the collateral for that. And so when grain prices plummet and they are unable to repay these debts that they've incurred during World War I, many of them default. And this farmer's foreclosure and default is the beginning of the cracks in this prosperity of the 1920s.
Right. Well, it's kind of one of those things where the system works until the moment it doesn't. Right? All of this looks great. As we talked about with the car metaphor, all this is great. People are buying tractors. People are buying all these things they want. great, we're having a great time until the moment we're not. And boy, does that moment come hard.
Right. And there's also a glut. So there's too much grain. They're
Yes.
producing this grain, and it was especially grain, bread stores. They were producing it, and then it was just sitting there because there was no longer a foreign market
Right.
for it, because those foreign markets were now producing their own grain again after
Sure.
World War One. So that is kind of the beginning of where we can start to see the problems. And this is kind of glossed over during the 1920s. It's not until 1929 that Herbert Hoover actually tries to help farmers, and then he passes a bill to help farmers, and then of course Franklin Delano Roosevelt goes all the way with it. But this ridiculous circular debt structure produced by the Treaty of Versailles is the next huge issue for the economy of the 1920s. So I'll try to lay this out. But first, let's talk about the nature of the Treaty of Versailles and how it set up reparations for Germany.
Right. So the Allied powers, or at least a few of the Allied powers, are going to want to kind of point to a country to blame for the destruction of World War I. And they're going to point to Germany. Right. And in this Treaty of Versailles, they're going to punish Germany for the destruction of the acts during World War I and require Germany to pay Britain, France, Belgium a lot of money, reparations. It's a good deal of money, and it's only going to harm Germany's economy in the long run. Of course, the effects of this are pretty far-reaching when we talk about World War II, but that's the type of debt structure that the Treaty of Versailles is encouraging.
Right, and it is an incredible amount. It's a number basically that it's unlimited. It's $33 billion, and of course, so basically the way we get this circular debt structure is, well, Great Britain, France, and Italy are our three biggest debtors after the war, and they owe us about $11 billion. Well, they're depending on Germany to pay reparations so that they can pay us. Well, the Germans get loans from U.S. banks to pay the reparations.
Yeah.
So money is flowing out of the United States to Germany. They turn around and hand that money to Great Britain and France, and it's coming straight back. Right. This creates this illusion that Germany is actually repaying their debt when in reality they're getting out of debt with the Allied powers and getting into debt with the United States. So the United States is effectively buying its own debt.
Right.
There, we're creating, we're lending money and then buying back the promise to repay that money ourselves. And so it creates this circular debt structure that comes back to haunt us in a big way.
Yeah.
Next, stock speculation. So what does that mean? Speculating on the stock market.
Speculating is essentially like a gamble, a bet that certain stocks are going to do really well. And again, the mindset of so many during the 1920s was get rich, have that lifestyle. And that involves spending a lot of money, often money that these people did not have, right? They had to borrow. And they're going to spend so much money on betting and gambling on these stocks. And again, as long as it works, it's great. And as soon as it doesn't, it causes a problem, because when those stocks don't pay back, those people can't pay back their debt. And again, we get into a rough debt cycle there.
It becomes kind of like a musical chairs situation where everyone's making all this money. Everybody wants to get in on the game. And while the music is playing, everyone's having a great time. But in the back of their mind, they know someday the music's going to stop.
Right.
And you don't want to be left without a chair.
No.
Right. So they're like, well, I'll get in now and I'll make my money. And then when the music stops, it won't be me. That was the mindset, was that when this music stops and the party's finally over, I will have already got what I wanted.
Yeah.
It'll be somebody else's problem. And I think that really contributed. 5% of all personal debt in the United States by 1929 was in the stock market. So 5% of money that people had been loaned, they had then bought stock with, which is an incredibly high amount for the time. It had never got above 1% until 1922.
Right.
So, and then finally, installment buying, right? This idea of credit. It was very hard before the 1920s for a regular person to get a loan to buy, say, a house or to buy a car. It was just unheard of to go into debt willingly. Like, going into debt was something that you avoided at all costs.
Sure.
And by 1925, going into debt is seen as the American way. It's normal. Installment buying is a normal part of American life. And so people go crazy with it.
Well, we were talking about in the last module about advertising, right? These companies from the 1920s are going to encourage this type of spending because through advertisements, through radio, they're able to market their products in a way that you hadn't been able to do before. So not only are these companies marketing their products, they're marketing kind of this way of life, right? This standard of living, having the new car, the new refrigerator, the new electric stove, all those type of things. And people are going to go in debt, and people are going to take out installment loans to get the things that they want to have the lifestyle that they believe they should have.
Right. And I've got it written down here. Mortgage debt increases by 8 times between 1922 and 1929. So the idea, it shows you in that statistic that the idea of borrowing money to build a house really became a fixture of American life in the 1920s. It had not been that way before. And this unimaginable amount of debt is incurred because people think the party's never going to stop.
Sure.
And I can gladly say this has never happened again in American history. Not like in, say 2008. No, we never learn. I will just say, just from the outset, the lessons of the 1930s and the 1920s, and then later the Depression, the consequences of the Depression, we never learn. And it just happens over and over again. It happens especially in the 70s, in the late 80s, in the early 90s, it happens again. In 2000, it happens again. And then, in my lifetime, perhaps not in our listeners' lifetime, some of them, but 2008 is just another example of, now we didn't enter into, it was called the Great Recession. We didn't enter into a Great Depression.
Sure.
And we'll see why that is, some ideas about why this was just so much worse than in subsequent or previous panics or recessions. But on the surface, everything looked great. And politically, the Republican Party is dominating on this prosperity. It's never going to end. But there were cracks in the prosperity. It was a rickety foundation to begin with, and we'll see what happens.
We'll see the cracks open up into
a chasm,
fissures. Yeah.
So the stock market crash of 1929. There had been stock market crashes before, but this one was a little bit different, because the music had stopped in like 1927, but nobody noticed. And so the effect of the stock market crash of 1929 was to slap everyone back into reality. It's known as Black Tuesday. October 29th, 1929 was the initiation of what we would now call a panic sell. So what's it mean if there's like a fire sale or a panic selling on the stock market?
Investors believe that they're going to lose money. And so they, in a panic, in fear of future losses, they're going to sell their stock extremely quickly. And it's not just, some of them selling here, some selling here at a different time. It's everyone in a very short period of time selling their stocks, which causes the values to tank.
The values drop drastically in a single day.
Yeah.
So, and of course, we know that in the stock market is the way that companies finance their ventures. Sure. Like, if people think that a company is going to continue to do good things, they're going to buy that company's stock.
Sure.
And that company's going to have more money to invest in future growth. And when the value of a stock plummets to, in some cases in the Great Depression, 0,
right,
that company ceases to exist, and the product they make ceases to exist, and the employees that they employ no longer have jobs. And so in this panic sell, in one day, the stock market loses 15% of its value. Now, to put that into perspective, a recession or a correction of the market now is considered 10%.
Yeah.
For that to happen in one day would be catastrophic. That if that happens over the course of a year, now that's considered a correction, right? That the market was too hot and it needed to cool. This happens in one day. And what this doesn't bring into account either is that on Monday it dropped by 12%. Right. So on Monday it's 12%. On Tuesday it's 15%. It's a free fall. Right. By the end of November, 50% of the value of the stock market is gone. 50%, half of the value of the stock market is gone. And companies are in a full panic. They have no money to expand, for sure. They have no capital to leverage to get loans.
Sure.
They are laying off workers. Unemployment climbs to 8% by the end of the year, which anything close to 10 is now considered a catastrophic
Yes.
amount, and you'll see it does not stop at 8.
No.
And
for regular Americans, who had their savings invested in the stock market, whose retirement depended on the stock market, who had taken out money through debt to buy on the stock market, this is truly the worst case scenario.
Right. And so only about 3 to 5% of Americans have actually owned stock. But we'll see how the stock market crash, which affected a small amount of people, grows
Sure.
to proportions that were before unknown. So unemployment's the first way that we see this, but then we'll see later on that the impact it has on banks is really going to be what pushes the depression onto the American people. The stock market will lose 90% of its value by 1931. So 90% of the value of American publicly traded companies is gone, wiped out in a 1 year period. That's unimaginable.
It is.
Right? Companies have no money they have no money to produce what they need to produce. They have no money to pay their workers. They have no money they're barely holding on. But things, this has happened before, maybe not to this level, but there have been really bad economic crashes. 1873 was really, really bad.
Yeah.
And it was, up to this point, it was definitely probably considered the worst economic depression
Sure.
in living memory for these people. And it was something they were going to get through. It was bad. It was something they felt like they could work through. So the crash of 1929 is one of the causes of the Great Depression, but it is not as if the crash happens and then automatically the next day, Great Depression.
Sure.
It takes about 2 or 3 years for the effects of the stock market crash, and along with other things, to really take effect on the American people. So one thing that the government does, which is exactly what they did in the early 1920s to stop the bleeding during the downturn in 1920-21, was institute a higher tariff.
Right.
Now, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. This is supposed to help American manufacturers,
Sure.
right? Well, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 raises the tariff rate to an unprecedented 60%. So it is effectively impossible for Americans to buy foreign goods.
Right.
And it has some unintended consequences.
It does, because when you slow down trade that much, that's a lot of money that is not coming to the U.S. economy.
Right.
And 60%, as you mentioned, is extremely
It's prohibitive.
high. Right. It's extremely high, prohibitive, like you said. So that's going to have a grave consequence, and that's going to be a lot of money lost. That's not coming to the U.S. economy. And on top of all these other things, right, on top of the debt situation and on top of the crash of the stock market, this all makes things worse.
Right. And the thing is, we institute this tariff to help American businesses. What do other countries do?
Right.
They retaliate. They institute their own tariffs. And by 1931, tariff rates around the world are so high, especially in Western Europe, from retaliation for the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that we aren't shipping anything overseas either.
Yeah.
That, like you said, world economics comes to a halt. And what happens? Well, if you remember, the Allies owe us about $12 billion. And a lot of people had lent money, right? And a lot of banks had lent money to the Allies, and a lot of banks had lent money to Germany. That circular structure of our debt, it's like a two-legged stool, right? It's over.
Yeah.
The music has stopped for that as well, and there are no more debt repayments.
No.
And American banks begin to fail.
Yep.
And when there are no more debt repayments by the Allies, by Germany, and reparations, American banks begin to fail, and this is really what precipitates the Great Depression.
And today, we'll talk about this today because of what we're about to talk about. If a bank closes, your money is insured by the federal government, right? That was not the case at this time.
Right, it's gone.
And so when these banks are closing, the money people handed them is gone.
Right. And so we have so many structures now within the federal government to combat what happened. Now, I will say, when I say that we didn't learn, I mean that human nature doesn't change.
Right.
People still want to get rich no matter what.
In a big picture.
Right. In a big picture, 30,000 foot way. In small ways, we have fixed this a little bit because like on October 29th, 1929, the government had no power to close the market.
Right.
Right. They had no power to close the market. And they now, as a result of 2008, especially when things got very much more strict in the stock market, now, if there's a fire sale going on, the federal government can step in and say, nope, we're shutting down the stock market. And the stock market will literally just be closed by the federal
You
government.
can't sell anymore.
Right. And no more selling today.
Right.
Right. And this is like the government applying the brakes.
Sure.
Well, in this situation, there are no brakes.
The car that's the axle is tied on with the zip ties.
Yeah.
No brakes on the car.
No brakes on the car. The government cannot step in and tell people to stop selling. And the thing is, it's self-preservation at that point. If I own stock in a company and I own 40% of the stock and I start selling all of it, the other people who own stock in that company are going to say, well, if I let this guy sell all of his stock, my stock's going to be worthless.
Yeah.
So I have to start selling. And so it was this vicious cycle of, if one person's going to sell, everybody has to sell.
You're trying to recover any scraps you can recover.
Right.
Yeah.
And people were selling their stock for pennies on the dollar. I mean,
Sure.
stocks that used to be worth, $100 were selling for $2 by 1932.
Yeah.
So bank failures. So the stock market crash really hurts. And when the debt crisis hits and banks are not able to be solvent anymore, they don't have money. Bank runs start because people lose confidence in the banking system.
Sure.
Now, let's talk about this really quick. Fractional reserve banking, right? I don't know how deep you are in economics. Fractional reserve banking is basically the idea that when I take $10 to the bank and I say, please put this in my checking account, they immediately take 8 or 9 of those dollars and they loan it out.
Sure.
So in the bank of my money, there is only $1.
Yeah.
Right? Now, this is an amazing thing because the money that I had in the bank, the other $9, is going out to somebody else in the community who needs it to run a business, to do the things that keep our economy going, right? That without being able to lend out the money that I have on deposit in the bank, our economy would contract.
Right.
And people wouldn't be able to get loans. Like buying a house would be impossible. Buying a car would be impossible.
Sure.
Keeping businesses that are going through hard times afloat would be impossible without fractional reserve banking. But the point is, if I go to get all 10 of my dollars,
It's not there.
right? They can give me my 10, right? But what if everybody goes to get their $10?
Right.
If everybody goes to get their $10, that money doesn't exist,
Right.
right? In green paper, that
Right.
money doesn't exist. And at the time, there was no government. The Federal Reserve wasn't in the business yet of ensuring that banks would be solvent, because there was this private banking kind of ideal in America where if your bank failed, it was your own fault, right?
Yeah.
So bank runs start in Louisville in 1930, and the first big bank to go down is the Bank of Kentucky in Louisville. And this is kind of localized, but then it spreads.
Sure.
And so in 1931, by 1931, this is starting to become a huge problem. The largest bank in the United States, called the Bank of the United States, not run by the federal government, but it's in New York. It's called the Bank of the United States.
Sure.
It is the largest bank in America. There's a bank run on the Brooklyn branch of the Bank of the United States, and they close. When they close the doors, everyone loses faith in the bank. When faith is lost in the system, it no longer works.
Sure.
Because it only works if everyone believes that they'll get their money, right? But everyone can't go at the same time.
If everyone is calm enough
Right.
to wait. But of course,
Nobody
almost
is.
impossible.
Right. It's just like the stock market.
Sure.
That if so-and-so is going to go get his money,
I
he's
gotta get
taking my
mine.
money,
Yeah.
right? I need my money, right? So this failure of the Bank of the United States is the beginning of the end for any hope of getting out of the Depression. 9,000 banks will fail between 1929 and 1940. And what this causes is a contraction of credit. You cannot get credit. And so because you cannot get loans, right, there's no new business.
Right.
There's no ability for businesses to recover because they don't have the money.
Right.
And what actually happens is fully one third of all the money in the United States is destroyed when these banks fail. So about 700 banks will fail in 1931, and this throws the United States into what we call the Great Depression because money is so scarce. The Federal Reserve does not step in and, what we would call now priming the pump, right? That like during times of economic downturn, the Federal Reserve will step in and they will introduce new money into the United States economy in order to stimulate buying, right? Which will fend off this decrease in the ability of the American people to buy the things that keep industry going, right?
Right.
So by 1933, the banks are failing every day.
Yep.
People who have had money in banks for years and saved their entire life to save, $1,000, that's just gone.
It's gone.
There's no deposit insurance, and people begin to despair. And this is why it is called the Great Depression, because people lost everything.
Yeah.
They lost everything they had, and not just a few people. This is everyone, basically. This is everybody.
And that last point you've got there, by early 1933, unemployment stood at 25%. I know 25%, often we think of that, we think, oh, that's not that much. But, and you mentioned this earlier, and people around our age or older will remember this, in 2009, 2010, unemployment got to be around like 10%.
Oh, yeah.
And that was an absolute disaster. People, kind of the government and people in those positions were freaking out because that was a lot of Americans out of work. 10% was bad. 25%
Unimaginable.
is a nightmare, right? Truly. And as you mentioned, this is not just impacting those rich 5% who have invested so heavily in the stock market. This is impacting every section of American society is impacted in some way by this utter nightmare and utter collapse of the system.
Right. And foreclosures on land and houses. I mean, people are being foreclosed on just thousands and thousands a day.
Yeah.
People are getting eviction notices. They don't have the money to pay. They can't work. There are no jobs. And I mean, it is a total collapse of the American economy.
Yeah. Not million, well, perhaps millions, I'm not really sure, but many Americans are not only homeless, but they're living in these kind of homeless villages, right? Almost like these shanty towns that will be nicknamed Hoovervilles, right? Because Herbert Hoover will be kind of blamed for not stepping in and doing some action to correct. And so this is a terrible time for all Americans.
Right. And so we'll go ahead and move on to Herbert Hoover's failed attempts to stem the tide of the Depression. Now, I do want to mention this. So there's a very simplistic view of this, that Herbert Hoover, rugged individualism is the term that many people use talking about Herbert Hoover, that he was a hands-off, laissez-faire capitalist who didn't believe in government intervention, right?
Right.
And to a certain extent, he was a laissez-faire capitalist. He didn't believe in grand government intervention, but he does some things that at the time were considered unbelievable.
Right. A bit more complicated than that.
He puts into action some government programs that got him labeled a socialist, right? I've actually so let's go through the things that he did, and then we'll talk about kind of the historical memory of Herbert Hoover. 1931, in 1930, he approves the building of the Boulder Dam, which will soon be called the Hoover Dam. It has a cost of $50 million at the time. So the cost of the Hoover Dam at the time that it was built was it was an unbelievable expense by the federal government to build the Boulder Dam. He was crucified by his fellow Republicans for sponsoring a reckless and extravagant public works project. Right? 1931, things get even worse, and he was really bad at naming things, because he starts this organization called the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief, or POOR. he did not have a good PR department
No.
because when your relief program has the acronym POOR, that's not good.
Maybe a little condescending.
Right. Now, this gave government the federal government the ability to oversee the allocation of private charity. And actually, there was a huge outpouring of private charity. And before all this even happens in 1929, when the stock market crashes, he meets with all the great industrialists of the time, including Henry Ford, and he says, look, guys, I need you to not lay off workers.
Mm-hmm.
He says, take a loss in profit. Just sacrifice profit for a while. If you start laying people off, it's only going to get worse. He said, because you know who buys the things that you make?
Your workers.
Your workers.
Yeah.
So if you lay them off and they don't have any money, what's going to happen to your demand for your product? It's going to go down. So just take a cut in profits and just keep wages where they are. But the point is, he didn't mandate it.
For sure.
He asked them
Right.
a gentleman's agreement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the president. I'm begging you, do this. But he gave them the freedom to not. Many of them didn't.
Right.
But the idea that he just said, well, all these poor people, let them eat cake, right? that he just said, I don't care about all these poor people.
Right.
That's just that's simply not the case.
True.
And the idea that he did nothing, simply not the case. So after his poor, organization, he institutes in 1932 the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and this is the first real government action that's going to give money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to give emergency loans to businesses, much like we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic with the government giving out money to businesses to stay afloat, to like paycheck protection and things like that. This is what the RFC is going to do. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation is going to give money to businesses so they don't fail.
Sure.
Now, people say, well, it was underfunded. There wasn't enough enthusiasm by Congress. He was fighting his own party.
Perhaps.
And if you're Herbert Hoover, what's the political situation like with these two sides?
Yeah, Herbert Hoover only stands to kind of lose here.
Yeah.
Right, because the Republican Party has changed a lot in the past 50 years of U.S. history, right? Where the Republican Party was once kind of during Reconstruction like the activist party, right? The Republican Party is pushing for government intervention. That has very much changed among most Republicans by this time. So as you mentioned, when Herbert Hoover is putting these programs in place, he's only going to be seen as a left-wing guy. Again, that label of communist socialist comes back so many times. He's going to be seen only in a negative way. And of course, the Democrats not wanting to, surrender an electoral win are not going to kind of give him the credit for this.
Right. And so in 1932, as well as the RFC, he implements the Emergency Relief Construction Act, $2 billion in federal aid. And you have to understand, when you heard during the COVID-19 pandemic that the government was going to hand out $1 trillion, that's basically what this was like. I mean, $2 billion is an unheard of amount of money for the government to be handing out right now. I mean, it's unbelievable.
It is.
Right. He also establishes these things called federal home loan banks, which now is, after 2008, they established Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, like these they were already established, but they were basically federally held mortgages that were secured by the federal government. And so that's basically what we're going to see here is it lent money to families that were in foreclosure, that in order to save American homes for families, he was going to lend government money to those people so they could keep their homes. And of course, he is stuck between a rock and a hard place. The Republicans, the Democrats hate him for this as well. I'm going to read a quote here. This is reckless and extravagant. Hoover thinks we ought to center control of everything in Washington, right?
Socialist.
Was that a quote by a Republican congressman, a quote by a Republican governor? No, that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932.
Yeah.
He says that the spending of the Hoover administration was reckless and extravagant, and then he wants government power centered only in Washington. That's FDR.
Yeah.
FDR's running mate, John Nance Garner. I know everybody knows the famous John Nance Garner.
He's my favorite vice president.
Right, my favorite vice president. I'm just kidding. Nobody knows who that guy
I don't
is.
either.
But here's what he said on the campaign trail. He said, as you pointed out, Hoover is, quote, leading the country down the path to socialism, right? So even the
Love it.
Democrats who would institute the New Deal later
Yeah.
accuse him of being reckless with the American dollar.
Yep.
In 1932, after all this, the New York Times, a quote from the New York Times said, no one in his place could have done more, right? This historical idea that Herbert Hoover did nothing is perhaps the greatest like public just lie that historians seem okay with, or at least that public historians
Sure.
seem okay with, that Herbert Hoover basically just was asleep at the wheel and just had no idea what was going on, and that he did nothing, right? Did he do enough? No, I don't think he did enough. The next question is, could anyone have done, quote unquote, enough?
Likely not.
We will see in the New Deal that no one could have done enough, because even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by the end of his first 2 terms, hasn't done enough.
Right.
But as you said, these shanty towns that pop up across the United States because people are homeless are called Hoovervilles, right? Empty and outturned pockets, like when you pull your pockets out of your jeans and they're sticking out.
I'm doing it right now.
Right. I just had a knee-jerk reaction. I have to do it as well.
Take a candle.
If you turned out your pockets to show you had nothing in your pockets, like you're broke, those became known as Hoover flags.
Very flattering.
Right. You were flying your Hoover flags if you had no money.
Right.
So he is derided. He's killed politically for this. And in 1932, veterans show up to Washington, D.C. to demand their bonus from World War I, which was not due to them until 1945. And it's called the Bonus Army.
Right.
And this kind of puts the last nail in the coffin of Herbert Hoover.
The optics of our boy Hoover could not be worse. Truly, as you mentioned, he did not have a good PR person. That is extremely, extremely true. Because despite all he's going to do, as we talked about, he's going to be crucified. He is
from both sides.
And again, today he is still seen as kind of this infamous president. Right. That's very true.
And so when he sends the Bonus Army home, which is what they called themselves. They wanted their bonus. They're all veterans. You know, the optics of him sending in the U.S. military to forcibly, with guns and tear gas, remove these veterans who are marching on Washington from the city. You know, fun fact to go along with this, Douglas MacArthur was actually the commanding officer of the military at the time, the military units that dispersed the Bonus Army. But can you imagine if the president, you know, there was a march on Washington for any particular reason, and the president sent out not the police, not, you know, the National Guard, the Army to disperse them with, you know, we'll say force that was considered even at the time to be too much.
Right. Imagine the president forcibly breaking up a demonstration of Iraq War veterans.
Right.
Imagine how that would look.
That would be it with the military.
Yeah.
So Hoover's presidency is over. The historical view of Hoover probably unfair, and we'll, you know, we could debate that all day, and you know, talk about it. But in 1932, we get this new infusion of hope from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR is what he becomes known as, and this guy just has something about him that's different.
He's the optics king.
Oh, he is the king of public opinion.
In the way that Herbert Hoover, not great at kind of communicating that message, again, the poor program, not great at optics. FDR is brilliant at this, and through so many things that he's going to do, he's going to be able to communicate that kind of message of hope and recovery in a way that Herbert Hoover just couldn't communicate it.
Right, and he's going to come into office with the famous inaugural phrase.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Right, that he says, it's my firm conviction, my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and that we have this unwarranted terror that we have to first master our fear to move forward. And this sticks with people. I mean, they have a fighter now. They whether it's true or not, they feel like they have someone who's going to go in there. And he does. He declares war on the Depression. He says, I'm going to declare war on the Great Depression. And we see this later with Lyndon Johnson declaring war on poverty, right? And now it's very, Reagan declares war on drugs. It's become very popular in our modern language to say, I'm going to declare war on this issue, right?
Right.
Which, let's get real, that's a very American thing to say. Right?
Yeah.
Anything we're battling it. We're fighting, you know. So he has this idea called the first 100 days, and after FDR, every president will partially be judged on what we call their first 100 days.
Yep.
And they're supposed to have a first 100 days agenda when they get into office. And a lot of times on the campaign trail, they will say, here's what I'm going to do in my first 100 days.
Mm-hmm.
Well, until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there was no such thing as the first 100 days. Right. He kind of invents this idea that presidents are supposed to come in and be vigorous and make changes. Right. So he has this idea of the 3 R's. So
in the 3 R's, again, with his messaging, he's going to be able to articulate that the 3 R's are not just thing to help you right now. It's going to be something that helps in the future, right? So like relief and recovery have to do with helping Americans who are suffering, recovering from the Depression. Those are kind of more like, you could maybe call them like shorter term goals. But with his reform, he's not just talking about kind of going back to normal, quote unquote, right? That last R, that reform, is talking about changing the U.S. economy so that these type of things don't happen again. So FDR's messaging is not just help for you right now. It is a message of a different American economic future.
Transformation.
Almost. Yeah, that's a very compelling message.
Mm-hmm. And so some of the things he does for relief is immediately he closes the banks.
Mm-hmm.
He closes all the banks, and he's just like, look, we got to sort this out before we open up any banks. We're going to have bank holiday, and we're going to get together, and we're going to sort out how we can stop these banks from failing. And one of the first things he does when he closes the banks, he takes the United States off the gold standard. Mm-hmm. We will return to the gold standard after World War II, but right now we remove the relationship of our currency to gold, and this frees us up to print money.
Sure.
Basically, we're able to spend without borrowing money from other countries, or because you couldn't take out debt. So there was no way to spend money without taking out debt. Well, you can't take out debt, so you have to just print money. Sure. And this is going to inflate the currency, but in his opinion, this was something that we had to do. We had to get this money. The only way to do it was to get us off the gold standard. Right. So you had to turn in all of the gold you owned. Mm-hmm. So if you owned gold, you turned that into a bank and they gave you cash for it. And that was the law. Yeah. You could not own gold. Owning gold was against the law. You had to turn in your gold to the federal government and they would give you dollars. Now, of course, that's a lot of the things that he does could be considered, not necessarily tyrannical, but extreme.
And his critics will make that clear.
Right. So that's one of the first things he does. The next thing he does is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So how does this help farmers? It basically pays farmers to not grow crops.
Yeah.
Right. Why would we do that?
Well, again, we've talked about how farmers have been suffering not only during the Depression, right, but in the 1920s as well. And the reason they're going to pay farmers not to grow anymore is because, and we mentioned this before, farmers have already produced too much, mm-hmm. right? And if you can limit production, that can raise crop prices and hopefully help out the farmers.
Right. So by paying them a certain amount of money to not grow mm-hmm. more than is going to be used, the prices of crops start to go up. Yep. Farm foreclosures start to slow down, and farmers for the first time in 15 years, 12 years, start to see a little bit of an uptick in their ability to really be active in the economy. Mm-hmm. Another thing is going to be the National Recovery Administration. This is basically just a continuance of Hoover's policy of giving loans to businesses so that they can expand and employ workers. The Public Works Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, along with the Tennessee Valley Authority, is probably the most recognizable part of this New Deal. And what do these three things do, especially the PWA, the CCC, and the TVA?
The goal of these work programs is to do just that, to put unemployed Americans back to work, doing projects for the federal government, right? Public Works projects, Public mm-hmm. Works Administration. And these programs, as you said, are going to have big impacts if you live anywhere near Tennessee, you have heard of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Public Works Administration are going to build things like public infrastructure, highways, bridges, things like that. The Civilian Conservation Corps, they're going to work to kind of preserve the natural beauty of the United States through natural parks. If you're local to Southwest Virginia, you've probably been to or heard of Hunger Mother Park, right? That park is it's a man-made lake. It's a man-made park, of course, through the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Smoky Mountain National Park, which again, probably a lot of folks local to Southwest Virginia have been to, that was a project of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So it's about finding these different causes or these different issues and putting Americans to work completing them.
Right. And the TVA, the other thing the TVA is going to do, which Hoover actually vetoed a bill that would have formed an earlier version of the TVA. One thing it's going to do is it's going to electrify the South.
Right.
And why is that such a big deal? Electrification, we talked about in the previous module.
Right.
Cities are electrified.
Sure.
The North is becoming electrified.
Sure.
Is the South electrified?
Not as much. And with electrification comes better possibilities for businesses, right? Allows factories to mechanize in ways they hadn't before in the South. It also allows citizens of the South to be a bigger part of American culture, right? With electrification, they have access to the radio, they have access to the telephone, and these different kind of inventions like the electric stove, electric refrigerator, et cetera. Now they have access to those. And so they're no longer as excluded from this common American culture. This is this is going to do a lot to kind of bring the South back into this American ideal.
And the first dam is actually built in 1933, just after construction begins in 1933, just after the TVA Act is passed. And it's in Norris, Tennessee. It's called the Norris Dam.
Yeah.
It's named after the senator from Nebraska who sponsored the bill to pass for the TVA. And over the years, the Norris Dam is north of Knoxville. I'm not exactly sure. It's about 30 minutes north of Knoxville.
I'm not sure either.
But now there are 29 total dams in the TVA system.
Wow.
One of them most of them are in Tennessee. A couple are in, I'm actually not sure if any of them are actually in any other states. I know there are lakes on the Tennessee River system, like Gunnersville Lake, that goes into other states. If you are native to Southwest Virginia or extreme East Tennessee, Northeast Tennessee, you'll know of lakes like Watauga Lake, South Holston Lake, Boone Lake. These are all TVA lakes. And all of the dams on the TVA lake system, river system, the Tennessee River system, produce electricity. And this begins with the TVA. Oddly enough, the first dam it doesn't actually dam up the Tennessee River. It dams up it made a reservoir on the Clinch River, which will flow into the Tennessee River later on. But so all of these things that are just helping people get back to work, it's giving them hope. It's giving them hope. And we'll see later that maybe the New Deal doesn't fix the problem of the economy.
Sure.
But did it fix the problem of the American broken psyche? Like this depressed mental state that the Americans are in? Did it fix that problem?
Yeah, I think you could say that it did. And again, FDR is that type of person to make a program like that work. Even if Herbert Hoover had done all these things, right? If he couldn't communicate in the same way that FDR did, it wouldn't have been as effective. Right.
And so you get Rexford Tugwell, who was a part of the Brain Trust, who came in he was a professor at Columbia, I believe. He comes in to be one of the leading economists that develops the New Deal policies. And he actually says in a quote from the 1940s here, he said, quote, "We didn't admit it at the time, but practically the entire New Deal was extrapolated from programs that Hoover started." Right? So that the idea that the New Deal is this FDR extravaganza, that's optics.
Right. Yes, it is.
Right. And look, that FDR had his strengths and his weaknesses. Hoover had his strengths and his weaknesses, but I think we can both agree Herbert Hoover is absolutely crucified by the American public, by historians. He's a laughingstock. And FDR, maybe what he did in World War II was exceptional. His leadership during World War II was exceptional. His leadership during the Great Depression was exceptional, but his economic policy is still up in the air as to whether it really had a positive impact on the economy. I think it can be said that it had a positive impact on the American consciousness.
Right.
People were back to work. There was dignity in work. There's no dignity in being handed, bread to eat. That people wanted to make their own way. That was part of the American style of living at the time. And like now, unemployment is a part of American life, as in like things happen. We understand that. There's no shame in unemployment. There's no shame in being between jobs. At the time, though, that wasn't the way Americans thought about unemployment.
No.
Right? They saw unemployment as a
personal failing, right? You have done something wrong, right? Maybe it's not the result of just accident or that the system has in some way failed. It's you as a person.
Right. And so what really changes this is the introduction of the Social Security Administration.
Yeah.
The idea that we're going to create a social safety net that is going to include disability benefits, that if you are injured and you cannot work, you'll get a certain amount of money from the government because you can't control that, right? The idea that if you're unemployed, you're going to get a certain amount of benefits from the government to offset the hardship of being unemployed.
Sure.
And also that you're going to be given a retirement pension paid for, technically paid for by you while you work, when you pay into Social Security, and then you receive from Social Security once you reach a certain age. Man, this is totally new at the time. I mean, unheard of new.
Right. And these types of programs almost certainly could not have happened outside of this sort of emergency of the Great Depression, right? This fear and this sort of feeling that things are going horrifically wrong will allow these huge changes to take place. And again, FDR can articulate those changes in the fireside chats where FDR is going to get on the radio and he's going to reassure Americans. Again, this is part of that mass culture, right? Americans have access to the radio. That's how this is possible. But FDR is going to get on the radio and he's going to say, hey, look, I'm doing these things, right? These programs are doing this. This is a dark day, sure, he's going to say, but we can make it through because we're Americans, because your president, your government is here to help in some way, here to make your life better. It's going to give Americans this feeling of, oh, there is someone, the president, the federal government, who is willing to help me, right?
Security. It literally gave them a sense of security.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
The economy and the national consciousness was in free fall.
Right. And
they needed a net to catch them, that he understood that before you can climb, you have to stop falling.
Right.
Right. Before you can start going back up the mountain, you have to hit the bottom. And we hadn't hit a bottom yet. We were still falling. And he provides this net that catches the American people, whether it's mental or economic. He provides this, and we feel like we're starting to climb back up. Now, sadly, after 7 years of the New Deal, unemployment is at 17.5%, right? So from a high of 25, it gets down to about 12% in 1935. But in 1937, he is up against the wall. He's told we cannot keep spending this much money. In fact, in 1939, his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., actually was quoted as, in a meeting of the Democratic Party leadership, he says, he warns them, he says, we can't spend anymore. He said, we've spent and we've spent and we've spent more than anyone's ever spent before.
Yeah.
And, things are getting better.
Right.
He says, I want nothing more than the prosperity of the United States, and I will do anything to achieve that. I'm willing to implement any policy that will achieve the prosperity of the United States, but it seems like this New Deal spending is simply not going to get it done. And so this brings us back to the question of, was there anybody anywhere who understood what needed to be done to get us out of this problem? I don't think there was. I don't think there was an answer to it. And we'll come back to that question here in a second. To add insult to injury, during the Great Depression, we have what's called the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. Yeah. And because of the farming practices of the 19 teens and 20s, where farming became incredibly mechanized, This removed a lot of the natural grasses and things from the Great Plains where it really doesn't rain very much.
No.
It's some places in the Great Plains where they grow food, especially in Oklahoma, Kansas, and northern Texas. It might only rain 10 inches all year.
They have like a semi-arid climate.
Right, a semi-arid climate where during the summer, it may only rain twice a month.
Yeah.
And so what they didn't understand was these natural grasses that they were getting rid of was the only thing storing water and holding the topsoil down.
Yeah.
And so when all these natural grasses are gone, they start to get unprecedented levels of wind erosion. And it turns into what will be called the Dust Bowl. 100 million acres become desolate in the middle of the country, mainly focused in northern Texas and western Oklahoma.
Right. It's an unbelievable number.
Right.
It's hard to wrap my mind around.
It's literally parts of entire states
Yeah.
become uninhabitable.
Yeah.
Right. 100 million acres is lost. It's so bad that in 1933, as part of the New Deal, FDR institutes the Soil Conservation Service, where they send scientists to the Midwest to determine how they're going to keep the soil in the ground.
Right.
Because dust storms were so big, they were called black rollers or black blizzards. They were so big that you could, they were hitting New York. They were hitting Washington, D.C., and there would be days where it would be foggy in New York, but that wasn't fog. It was the topsoil from the Midwest being blown by prevailing winds. And you'll see this week in the resources for the module, some of the pictures of incoming dust storms. They look fake. They look photoshopped.
Yeah.
They're terrifying.
They are.
And sometimes these dust storms would last for a week, and visibility would be 3 feet. So during one of the larger dust storms in Texas, visibility was 3 feet for days. You couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face. You couldn't go outside.
And for farmers, I mean,
Right.
for their crops, what a nightmare, right? It's going to bury crops, smother them. It's just a total disaster. And again, this is all happening kind of with the Great Depression anyway in the background, as you said, adding insult to injury. This is just, this is devastating for the people suffering.
Like just another statistic that just you can't wrap your mind around. By 1936, the Dust Bowl was so bad that the government estimated that the loss in monetary, to be measured in dollars, the loss per day in 1936 was $25 million, which in adjusted for inflation in 2022, that'd be about $500 million a day per day that was being lost due to the soil erosion in the Midwest and on the Great Plains. This caused a huge migration to California from the Midwest, and from that we get these images.
Yeah, Dorothy Lang is a extremely famous American photographer. She's going to photograph a lot of different kind of parts of U.S. history in the 1930s and 40s. She's going to photograph the Dust Bowl. She's also going to photograph Japanese internment, which we'll talk about. But anyway, she's going to produce some extremely famous photographs of suffering Americans during this time period. Her most famous one, of course, is called Migrant Mother, where you see this woman who looks understandably just devastated, right? And she confused.
She doesn't know what to do.
Right. And to make that worse, she has two kind of also despondent crying children on her shoulders. So Dorothy Lang is producing these images from this time period that help convey how wretchedly miserable life in this place at this time could be.
Right. And ironically, she is actually able to do her work because she's given a grant through the New Deal for humanities, right? For art, because that was part of the New Deal, was they were going to fund artists to create things that get Americans back to this creative spirit. Well, some of it was kind of sad. That woman's name, actually, Florence Owens Thompson, they found her later and interviewed her. And her story was sad.
Yeah.
I mean, as many of them were, 500,000 people became homeless between 1933 and 1936 due to soil erosion. I mean, the environmental impact of the Dust Bowl now is unimaginable to us.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of environmental consciousness that we now have, if something like this was happening, it wouldn't be. It would be public enemy number one. I mean, it would bring together any political party. It wouldn't matter.
A war on the Dust Bowl.
Right. We would wage a war on the Dust Bowl.
Right.
At the time we had bigger problems. Believe it or not, they actually believed that this was a tertiary issue. It wasn't something we had to it wasn't the most important thing
Right.
at the time. 116,000 families will move from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado to California.
Mhm.
And what they find in California is the Great Depression.
Yeah, not the promised land.
Right. And this becomes the famous story of the Grapes of Wrath,
Yeah.
written by John Steinbeck, about this terrible experience of the Dust Bowl and then this migration west and getting there. And all they find in California is heartache.
Yeah.
And, a very sad story, but it kind of is the epitome of the Great Depression and the helplessness of many people during the period.
What an unbelievable contrast we have from, last module we were talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald's works, especially his early ones, the Jazz Age, the parties, the drinking, the money, the cars, right? You get the
Mhm.
image, right? It's that classic 1920s image. To go from that to then go to the works of John Steinbeck and Grapes of Wrath and the images of Dorothea Lange, that is such a tragic fall.
Right. The hopeful and exuberant culture of jazz and like even in the Harlem Renaissance,
Yeah.
to go from that high of ecstasy to the low of no work, farms are failing, everything about American culture is breaking down. It is very much a Jekyll and Hyde situation. So just to finish up, this could be argued, was the New Deal a success? I think in some ways it was a success, in other ways it wasn't. I think economically, we can't really make the argument that it was successful in terms of getting America out of the Great Depression. I mean,
I think that's a strong argument. I think there's a better argument to be made that the New Deal will reform U.S. society in some longer term ways,
Mhm.
right? And we've already talked about it a little bit with like the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, right? To make sure that your money in banks is insured by the federal government, so you
Right.
don't just lose it. With Social Security, right? Unemployment benefits, retirement benefits. Those are things that we benefit from now.
the U.S. Housing Authority, another part of this,
Exactly.
that government housing for homeless people, it has its problems. No doubt it has its problems today. There are wait lists for government housing that are just ridiculous in
Mhm.
most cities. But the idea that the government was going to provide housing for people who couldn't afford it or who had hit hard times and needed somewhere to stay, that in itself sticks with us today.
Sure.
That we still have the Housing Administration, the Housing Authority, like you said, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That restored faith in banks and really the faithlessness of banks, like the breakdown of trust between the American people and banks was why banks failed. So the restoration of that faith in banks is something that we take for granted today. We know that if a bank fails, now I don't know what the actual limit on the FDIC is now. It might only be $10,000.
I'm not sure.
But at the time, people restored their faith in the banking system, and that helped banks it's helped stem the tide of bank failures.
When we think back to his 3 R's, I
Mhm.
think you could probably, I'd say most folks would agree that the most successful of those R's was probably the reform, the
And
longer term actions.
one thing that in this huge concoction of an episode that we've made that we kind of glossed over that we shouldn't have was that prohibition is repealed.
You're
Right. That the 21st Amendment in 1933, late 1933, repeals prohibition. Alcohol is now legal. Why? Because it can be taxed.
Yeah.
Alcohol can be taxed, and he thought that was one way that they were going to raise revenue
Sure.
to get out of the financial hole that they were in. So that's another reform that we take for granted. That
Sure.
at the time, it was a reform during the Progressive era to get rid of alcohol, and it was a reform during the Roosevelt administration to reinstate alcohol as being a legal thing in the United States.
Very true.
Was Hoover to blame for the Depression? Can we blame Hoover for the Depression?
I think it'd be really hard to blame Hoover for the depression.
Right.
The worst thing we could probably lay at Hoover's feet was poor communication, poor optics.
Right. He didn't inspire the American people.
No.
None of the presidents of the 1920s who were Republicans, all of them were. Warren G. Harding dies in office. Calvin Coolidge.
He was literally called Silent Cow.
Right. Silent Cal. He famously, he was told, a woman said, "I think I can get you to say more than 2 words all night at a party or something at the White House, and he said, "I've got 2 words for you: you lose." Right? So she lost the bet because she couldn't get him to say more than
Right.
2 words, and he, they just kind of let things go.
Yeah.
And the prosperity was there, so they thought everything was going okay.
Sure.
And then you have Hoover, who is really smart. He's an engineer by trade. He did apparently great things as the Secretary of Treasury. Or no, excuse me, he was the Secretary of Commerce
Okay.
under the Coolidge administration. He comes in and he's just not he's not prepared. But could anyone have been prepared?
Seems unlikely.
Seems unlikely anyone was prepared. I think this is what we could call a black swan event, an
Really?
event that you couldn't predict. Models would not have shown you it was going to happen. All the things that came together to make the Great Depression what it was, the stock market crash, the debt crisis that followed World War I, the debt structure that caused part of the default of foreign debt that led to the failure of banks. And then also you add in the Dust Bowl and the failure of American farming. It was a perfect storm that couldn't have been predicted. And because it couldn't have been predicted by the models that they had at the time, they didn't know how to fix it. And so hindsight's 2020. We can look back and say, well, they should have done this, they should have done this, they should have this. But they did everything they knew how to do and more. They did things that never could have been imagined by previous administrations during the Roosevelt administration, and it still didn't put a dent in it.
And perhaps there's a lesson for us to learn about our perception of presidents. We often see presidents as these sort of larger than life figures, right, who have unbelievable control and can master forces larger than themselves. But, maybe the Great Depression helps us see that presidents are just people, right? And there are often much larger trends and forces at work that presidents can't have only a limited control over.
Right. And so the Great Depression had, no pun intended, a sad time in American history. It is
aptly named.
It's aptly named. And it was a confluence of tragedy that just never to be repeated. I mean, even in 2008, with the most recent real crash of our economic system, the pain felt by the American people was nowhere close to the pain. I mean, there were people who had a really rough time in 2008 to 2010, but overall, America came out of it. America doesn't really come out of this until the 1950s. I mean, we don't really see, because during World War II, we have an uptick in production, but all that production is by the government.
Sure.
Right? That's the government, sending young men overseas to be shot at by Nazis in France.
Yeah.
And we're building planes that are going to go bomb cities and destroy cities in other countries. That's not production, right? That's not producing things. We're destroying things during World War II.
Yeah.
It's not until the 1950s that we really see an end to this financial problem. I mean, it's literally almost a 20-year phenomenon, and it shapes a generation. The generation that lives through the Depression and then through World War II is unlike any generation in American history. Even, I think, probably a more hardened generation, if it's possible, than the generation that lives through the Civil War.
And let us not forget that during the Great Depression, the Jim Crow era is still there. Right. So that's just another layer of things. The benefits of the New Deal that FDR hoped to disperse often fail in a segregated way.
Right.
So that's just, again, that is another layer of awful that can get stacked onto the 1930s. Yeah.
So, I hate to say I had fun with this episode. I enjoy the topic. But it's a little bit of a sad note in American history. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you are better able to engage with the resources for the week. And hopefully we'll be able to have some modules in the future that are a little more victorious.
Maybe go take a walk now.
Yeah, maybe go outside, get some air.
Touch the grass.
Yeah. All right. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will be back again soon.